Hello, and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. I often criticize Battle for Azeroth for having malicious writing, Shadowlands for having incompetent writing, and Dragonflight for having safe or dull writing. Today I'm going to look at Dragonflight specifically, and I think safe is the word I'm going to prefer to use here. Because while both are apt, I feel like safe has a more neutral connotation. It's certainly not flattering, but there are far worse things you could call it. Because truth be told, the writing of Dragonflight wasn't bad, it just had some noticeable shortcomings to it. And it even nailed certain aspects of story writing better than any other expansion. But first things first, let's analyze how Dragonflight came to be the way it was. And a lot of that had to do with Battle for Azeroth and especially Shadowlands, the latter of which went real hard on the whole fate of the universe thing, which you rarely want to do. And both of those expansions could be considered relatively depressing. This coincided with a whole lot of real life drama that happened during Shadowlands. Obviously, we had the whole pandemic going on, but we also finally had a light being shown on a lot of the degeneracy that was occurring in the upper Blizzard brass. A lot of players and streamers felt that they could no longer respect the company and actually quit WoW over it. Some of which quite hilariously came back once WoW was in vogue again. Though Blizzard did respond quite heavily to the situation, the efficacy of any of those given changes did vary quite wildly. Changing the name of Macquarie to Eridath? Good move. Changing the Don Quixote reference damsels from Ungoro into town dwellers? Kind of a stupid move. But either way, between the tone in WoW itself and the tone in real life, players were begging for a break, a sort of vacation expansion from all of the doom and gloom. And that's pretty much exactly what Blizzard gave us. Now, it'd just be downright wrong to assume that Dragonflight was created specifically in response to the situation. Expansions take way more time to develop than that. But perhaps certain elements of it pivoted a bit to better align with the message they wanted to be putting out. And hey, it worked. Dragonflight was pretty well received all in all. Most people don't have it as one of their favorites, but nobody really puts it at the bottom either. WoW players circa 2022 were ready for a break expansion, and everything was a lot more relaxed. I'm not sure calling it a small-scale story would be accurate, but even at the height of its stakes, only Azeroth itself was at risk. Granted, we all know Azeroth is super important in the cosmic storyline, but that's not really the point here. It was just a far less dramatic and more introspective expansion, and it succeeded spectacularly at healing how both players and devs felt about the game. I also think it's the expansion with the most coherent theme throughout, which was family. You feel it most with the blue and black flights, but they all sort of touch on it. Whereas I don't really feel like any other WoW expansion has a clearly defined theme. If you really wanted to force it, you could maybe argue that MoP or BFA were about burying old hatreds to make a better future. Maybe Legion was about not being constrained about your pre-existing worldviews. But all of those are pretty big stretches. Those are just sort of things that were touched on near the end of the expansions. Another resounding success that was in stark contrast to Zoval in Shadowlands was that they introduced new villains that were actually fun and likable. I wound up liking the Incarnates way more than I expected to. Raszageth was probably my favorite just because she's so over the top and crazy, and I will never forgive Blizzard for not showing us her visage form. Farak was admittedly a bit of a cliche, being the hot-headed fire user, but it was honestly really refreshing just having a villain whose only goal was to have fun and burn stuff to the ground. Iridikron is genuinely smart and calculating and doesn't underestimate us, which is a nice change of pace. Virnoth probably wound up being the least interesting, but at least even after becoming a good guy, she still has that icy bite to her. Probably my biggest criticism of the group was just that we didn't get to see them interacting together that much. And the whole Blue Dawn questline is pretty much universally praised. I kind of hated Kalik before Dragonflight, and it made me not hate him. That's impressive. And I think it's because they kept him humble and sort of gave all of the members of the Blue Dragonflight that featured in the storyline equal billing. Of course, there was the simulacrum of Sindragosa, who was doing her best to look after her descendants, and who was surprisingly chill interacting with Hala, who succeeded her as Malygos' consort. There was the old and wise Senegos helping to bring Zeros into his own, and who had a very touching send-off. And I even liked a little bit with Kirigosa. It helped underscore that you can still be family even if your place is not physically with your family. And there was even a nice little treat for those those of us who had Dragon Wrath. They absolutely nailed it with this questline. As we move on to the storylines for the other flights, my criticisms are going to become a bit more pronounced. The story for the Greens just didn't land with me super well. Granted, the theme of family is definitely still there. Marithra is still struggling in taking over leadership of the flight in lieu of her mother Ysera, and as part of that they decided to bring Ysera back for the expansion. Now, I know the backstory behind this is that one of the devs lost her mother in real life, and that she wished she could have this final chance to say goodbye as well. But I don't think this little bit behooved Ysera or Marithra's stories that much. I know it was just temporary, but reviving Ysera again sort of takes away from the awesome storyline of Ardenweald where you do it the first time. And it really just felt like Blizzard's billionth excuse to remove Malfurion from the story. Especially since Ysera herself didn't even do that much. Like, yes, she did some ephemeral, dreamy stuff that only she was capable of pulling off, but her actual narrative role was very minor. I guess I do appreciate that Ysera now has this Ardenweald death aspect to her character that makes her feel more unique and not just Alexstrasza's little sister. But Marithra herself, I really don't care about her, I'm sorry. We had a whole lot dealing with the Black Dragonflight, especially since that involved the Drakthir. On the one side you had Sarkareth, as well as Rathian and Sibelian, who each in their own way were sort of obsessed with claiming their father's legacy. Sarkareth out of pure fanaticism, and Rathian and Sibelian more out of hubris, as well as a desire to believe that Neltharion did have good in him and that it was mainly the old gods that steered him down the wrong path, since the two of them themselves are both fundamentally good people. And on the other hand, we had Emberthal and Abyssian, who were both ashamed of their heritage, and who together were trying to figure out how to reconcile that shame along with leading their flights into a better future. And there's a lot of good stuff here. I feel like the dynamics were very well set up. I'm just not completely satisfied with all of the resolutions, and maybe that's just me being nitpicky. First of all, Sarkareth was definitely not compelling enough of a character to make the final boss of Aberrus. Second of all, I don't know if I actually like that they emphasized that Neltharion was always a bad guy. Yes, it served as a bit of a lesson for Rathian and Sibelian, but you could have done the reverse and had Abyssian have to accept the fact that his father did do good things at one point. You could have had Neltharion be someone who made some dubious moral decisions, but who genuinely did care about his flight. And hammering in that actually he just always sucked kind of feels like a millennial mindset, and I'm saying this as a millennial. We like to blame a lot of our problems on our parents and how they raised us and all of the mental baggage that came along with it. But like, our parents are only human. They're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna make mistakes. I know too many people who are just too ready to hate their parents for how they messed them up, but you can just recognize their flaws and love them in spite of those flaws. And thirdly, I think Abyssian's rise to the new aspect of Earth was a bit unearned. Everyone likes to believe that the ideal leaders are those who do not want the position, and while there is a nugget of truth in that, I think overall that is a very flawed conclusion. Like, no, the best leaders are usually people who want to lead. You just need to weed out those who would abuse the power. One of my favorite examples of this is Marjorie Tyrell from Game of Thrones. Yeah, she was manipulative and wanted to be queen just so that she could be queen, but she was genuinely one of the best rulers in the show. She did a lot to help out the poor and the common folk. And most importantly, she was super hot, which I guess is a point in both Sibelian and Rathian's favor. And she had the political guile to survive a lot, just not to survive wildfire. So the idea that Abyssian is being rewarded with aspecthood because he didn't want it doesn't really fly with me. Like, he literally opted to stay outside of the Aberrus raid while Rathian and Sibelian chased down Sarkareth. That kind of passivity should not be rewarded. And on that note, I would have preferred if they'd done sort of a story of three brothers. But instead, it felt like a story of two brothers, the knuckleheads, Rathian and Sibelian, and also Abyssian is there, being the good brother. I'm sorry, it's just a good storyline that was so close to being a great storyline. Moving on to the Red Flight, there just wasn't that much there. Like, after her initial tussle with Raszageth in the Waking Shore, Alexstrasza does surprisingly little in this story, which was really weird considering they made her the entire face of Dragonflight. I almost think it's because she had to pull double duty as leader of the Reds and leader of the Dragons as a whole, so any story involving the Dragon Isles sort of implicitly involved her, but it meant she as an individual character and her flight didn't get that much attention. Probably the most memorable and funny part was just the whole Dragonkin Rebellion storyline. I'm sure many of you might remember the dialogue where Alexstrasza basically admits that she hadn't considered that dragonkin might have dreams of their own beyond fighting wars for dragons. Which I know a lot of people also like to complain about how Alexstrasza speaks as if everything has great importance. And I just like to take those two things together in my own headcanon that Alexstrasza has some sort of neurodivergency, but that she's the dragon queen and nobody wants to question what's going on with her. And I actually like her character a lot more with that headcanon in mind. So yeah, I guess my main complaint there is just we didn't get that much of Alex. Moving on, we have Viranoth's story, and she sort of took all of the disparate and more niche flights underneath her wing. So that in and of itself very heavily ties into the idea of adopt a family. It doesn't matter if you're a proto-dragon, a nether drake, a storm drake, she'll look out for you. Really, my biggest complaint here was just that her heel face turn happened way too quickly and easily. It was basically, well, Aridocron's off doing his own thing, and Farak is unhinged and off his chain, so you don't want to deal with that. And boom, suddenly she's an ally. And not much later, boom, she's the sixth aspect. It is a completely believable character trajectory, it just needed a bit more time to breathe. But probably the worst handled flight storyline was with the Bronze. It really felt like Nosdormu's whole fall and the conflict between the Bronze and the Infinite was just resolved with a brief little experiment and heart-to-heart. Like, okay, Eternus just had to learn that some things can't or at least shouldn't be changed, and Nosdormu just needed to loosen up a little bit and let a few tiny things be changed. Okay, we're all friends now, we just have to beat up Deos and it's not an issue anymore. Like, there's some real heavy stuff they could have explored with Nosdormu. He has to grapple with causality and preserving the true timeline, and accepting that he's gonna go down this path he doesn't want to preserve that timeline. Like, there's a lot of moral quandaries to wrestle with here. But the resolution was basically just, infinite dragons are bronze dragons, let's just get along, we're family. Yeah, I get it, Chromie is plucky and she wants to save Nosdormu even if he doesn't believe he can be saved, but it's too easy. Which kind of leads us into Dragonflight's most pervasive problem, which is just the whole talk therapy vibe. Now, to be absolutely clear, therapy is good, go get therapy. And lighthearted, gentle side quests can be a good thing in proper moderation. It's just that Dragonflight put these everywhere and it really got exhausting. And to illustrate that point, I'm just going to run through the ones that I remember offhand. There's the quest early on where you talk with Veritastraz, the red dragon in a dwarf visage, where he just reminisces on his younger days and his black dragon friend that he had to part ways with. There are the quests involving Voraxian, the black dragon, who you introduce to Veritastraz and who needs help coming to grips with the Black Dragon's history and how to move forward from that. There was Tutankhan, who was the chieftain of the Uxtalut Tuskar, who you have to help move past the death of his pet Autuk so that he can train a younger one, get out of his funk, and become an effective chieftain again. There was Duraz Scaletaker, the Dragon Ma orc in Waking Shore, who has come to the Dragon Isles to confront his guilt over the atrocities he committed against the Red Dragonflight in his younger days. There were just a bunch of couples that you had to help out, including two centaurs that you had to help propose to one another. In Thaldraszus, we have these bronze draconids whose job it is to maintain the roads, and you help Alvi, one of them, realize that she would rather pursue her passion of drawing instead. You had the Night Elf Heritage questline, which had very little actual Night Elf history, and felt more like it was about Maeve learning not to be dismissive of a young night elf just because he happens to be a mage. And there was also Hudson, the Tuskar painter, who decides to give up painting because he found love, and in a cruel twist of fate, being happy has caused him to lose his spark. This last one actually made me pretty sad, but probably for the wrong reasons. As someone who has made creativity a core part of his self-identity, the idea of having to give that up was just a real downer. I'm definitely not saying that Hudson made the wrong choice, and as someone you could probably describe as hyporomantic, possibly with an avoidant attachment style, I'm not the first person whose opinion you should consider here. So yeah, that was just a handful of them, and I'm sure there were many more you could include. And again, used sparingly, many of these quest chains are fine or even downright good, but they don't exist in a vacuum, and taken all together, it just felt like a huge overabundance of therapy quests, especially when many of the main campaign quests felt therapy adjacent as well. And a lot of the time, there just wasn't that much subtext. You can't just have characters announcing how they feel. That makes me feel angry. It's completely understandable that people started asking what happened to the war in Warcraft, and this seemed to be underscored with patch 10.2.5, where Gen, Tyrande, and Malfurion stepped down so that Tess Greymane and Chandra's Feathermoon can take over as the new leaders of the Worgen and Night Elves. So Gen and Tyrande, probably the two biggest warhawks on the Alliance, are out of the picture for now. Heck, Gen basically admits as much, that he's just too old and stuck in his ways. You can almost feel the real-life political values seeping into the video game. And the last real knock that I'm going to give Dragonflight's writing was just that there weren't any real heck yeah moments. I think they tried to do this with the Avengers Assemble moment, but that didn't feel earned, and it just made you wonder why this world-ending threat was the first one where everyone happened to have some free time. But yeah, it just would have been nice to have a few moments where you could really start pumping your fists. All in all though, I think people will look back on the Dragonflight story pretty favorably. It was far from perfect, but I've always said that Warcraft writing doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to not piss you off. Yes, the writing felt very safe, but it came at a time where safe was something we could tolerate or even desire. That being said, I'm still very glad that the War Within story has already felt a bit punchier, and that is an upward trend that I very much hope continues. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Alexstrasza because, as I said, she was basically the image of Dragonflight. They did give her quite the makeover from her Wrath of the Lich King design. I was not sad to lose the Peg Bundy hair, nor the bikini armor that honestly just felt like it was ripping off Sylvanas' new model. She looks much better now, although her outfit is perhaps a bit too busy. That being said, I was a big fan of the fur lining that goes around her arms. It really adds to the regal feeling that she should have, and I was a big fan of the details that they added to her face. There's this almost eyeliner effect that is actually just her like reptilian draconic elements framing her eyes. I did not put a lot of effort in trying to replicate that with my much more simplistic art style. And I really like that they gave her freckles. Normally I am not a freckle fan, but she makes them work. I did try to include those and spent way too long trying to get them to work. I'm still not entirely satisfied with how they turned out, but you have to call it good enough eventually. And I am a fan of her character, even if she gives off big, benevolent, neutral NPC vibes. I think War of the Scaleborn actually explains that that's almost a image she has to put up as the Dragon Queen. So I am excited to hopefully read that one in the future. And though we didn't see a ton of it in the game, I did appreciate her dynamic with Virenov. Also, as a bit of a side note, Alexstrasza does feature in the War Crimes novel, where Tyrande calls her to the stand and tries to get her to condemn the Dragamot orcs to then extend that condemnation towards Garrosh. And Alexstrasza just no-sells it. She's like, yeah, I would give them forgiveness if they genuinely asked for it. It completely flusters Tyrande, and I love that moment. And for the background, I decided to go with the Waking Shore. I mean, it just feels like the most red Dragonflight zone in the game, even if it's partially shared with the black Dragonflight. And it's a pretty gorgeous zone overall. It's like a more lush, less intense version of Thousand Needles. And lush is what it should be. The red Dragonflight are the protectors of life. And that is it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.